Hello viewers, in this session you will learn about the literary concept named absurdism. I am sure it is going to be quite interesting for you all to learn about something which is named itself absurd. But let me tell you before we read or understand more about that, the purpose of studying the concepts like absurdism and others or any other literary movement etc. is to acquire a guide which will help you, which will be a kind of aid to study, understand, enjoy any piece of writing. This type of understanding gives easy access to the related aspects to have better overall perspective of the piece of writing. So, once you have some kind of background knowledge about anything, you will be able to understand in a better perspective. For more clarity on the term absurdism, let us have a closer understanding about the meaning. As you can observe, the term absurdism comes from the word absurd, the literal meaning of which is something unusual, something strange, peculiar, away from the traditional normal things. Absurd is an activist style in which structure, plot and characterization are disregarded. In order to stress the lack of logic in nature, understand why do we read this concept. It is nothing but in the works of absurd, it is the contrast which is presented in order to stress the lack of logic in nature and man's isolation in a universe which has no meaning or value. That is what is projected in the works of absurd literature. Structure, plot, characterization all are disregarded. The term is derived from the Latin word absurdus, which is a combination which is formed from ab and zurdus, meaning deaf and stupid. So, we can understand absurdism in easy terms as a kind of literature which does not employ the traditional plot structure, a piece of writing where there is no adherence, where we are not like sticking to the accepted norms. In absurd philosophy, the absurd arises out of fundamental disharmony between the individual's search for meaning and the meaninglessness of the universe. And that means there is always a conflict which is existing. That is what is there in the absurdist philosophy. The philosophy that encompasses, that means it has in it, the absurd is referred to as absurdism. It is a philosophical concept. Philosophical led to a thought process, thinking that it refers an attempt to find reason in his life. A man is attempting to find reason in his life existence, which is disturbed by his humanly limited constraints. That means it is a kind of philosophical concept where it is presented that man is limited or there is no meaning, a fuller meaning or complete meaning for a man in his life, because there are limitations which are compelling him. Whatever he wants, he is not able to attain. That means there is something else which is working on them. So, in a way that is what is presented, the conflict between the universe and the man in absurd works. The writers most commonly associated with absurdism are Samuel Beckett, Jean Genet, Arthur Adamov, Harold Pinter, and there were some other lesser known dramatists. Now, after knowing the meaning of the word absurd, let us look at a term or a phrase, an expression which was very closely related, or rather to say interchangeably used to convey about absurdism, and that is theatre of the absurd. Absurdism and its more specific companion term, theatre of the absurd, refers to the works of a group of Western European and American dramatists. The plays which were produced or written by the dramatists during the 1950s and the early 1960s. The term theatre of the absurd was coined by critic Martin Esslin, who identified common features of a new style of drama. Look, we are talking about a style, but what is the style? There is nothing permanent. There is nothing which is a kind of norm or rule. That is what is the style of absurd. It seemed to ignore theatrical conventions, all the plays which belong to absurd category, there is nothing like adherence to theatrical conventions, and they messed up the expectations of the audience. It's a positive development. Yes, it may be appearing very strange, but absurdism is a positive development in the history of the theatre. Absurd drama subverts logic. It is something contradicting logic. It relishes the unexpected and the logically impossible. The theatre of the absurd became a catchphrase, much used and much abused. What does it stand for, and how can such a label be justified? Perhaps let's try to understand this better. But it will be a kind of attempt when we just look at the second question first. How can you justify that? There is no organized movement. Like all the concepts and movements in literature, they have some sort of organized movement where there is a kind of school or some people who say, fine, we belong to so and so field. But here this is something very peculiar, again absurd. When you go for asking the playwrights who are named, categorized as absurd dramatists, when you ask them, do you belong to the theatre of absurd, they will reply no, because there is nothing like a tradition for them at all. They do not stick adhere to anything which is there as a norm, as a tradition. They just do, they just depict, they just write whatever appeals to them. And these plays are characterized by a departure from realistic characters and situations. The plays offer no clear notion, no clear idea of time or place in which the action occurs. Characters are often nameless, they seem interchangeable. That means a person on the stage is donning the role of one, and after some time something else. So like that there is a kind of interchange in the roles as well. Events are completely outside the realm, outside the control of rational motivation, and they have a kind of nightmarish quality. Both dialogue and incidents appear to the audience as completely nonsensical, even farcical. I am sure a kind of question may pop up. If it was nonsensical, even farcical, why did it become popular? Maybe people were, let's try to understand it in this way, maybe people were tired of looking at the monotony where there is a particular pattern which is there. They wanted to free themselves from all the rules as such and speak something which is never expected and never presented. However, beneath the surface of these kind of absurd plays, there was something which was a bit pathetic and stark. Loneliness, isolation, failure of individuals to connect with others in any meaningful way. That's what was presented. Senselessness of life and death. So something which was stark was presented in a satirical, humoristic way. Theatre of the absurd is concerned with inward reality without stabilizing the influence of a moral perspective. Nothing like a compulsion. This is the way how you have to make a beginning. This is the way how you have to enter the stage on the theatre. Nothing as a something which is very weird to the audience, but then that was expected from the characters. Therefore, in normal sense, it is said to be corrupt. Why corrupt? Because there is nothing like a set pattern. There is nothing like a kind of coherence. There is nothing which you can expect. Unexpected is something which was expected by the audience who are there for absurd play. The playwrights identified with the movement have nothing in common with each other except the rejection of theatrical traditional conventions. Look here, what was common among them? Rejection. What was they rejecting? The common conventions. The practices were what? Rejected by all the people. But nothing they had among themselves common except rejection. Please do remember. Absurd theatre is a theatre of situation as against the more conventional theatre of sequential events. That is something to do with the situation, not the sequence. It presents a pattern of poetic images. Something like kind of bizarre, having a kind of very like tattered or something which is not really in any way coherent is what projected. Apart from plays, there was something else as well which was attaining prominence during this phase or in the concept of absurdism, and that is absurdist fiction. Absurdist fiction is a kind of literature, it's a type of literature most often employed in novels, plays or poems that focus on the experiences of characters in a situation where they cannot find any inherent purpose of life. That means futility of life. There is nothing which is specific. Why are they existing? Existing itself is in question. Most often represented by ultimately meaningless actions and events. In its critique of language and the absurd fiction closely reflects the preoccupation of contemporary philosophy with language, efforts to disentangle language. Language was never really coherent. In a way, what you want to convey by using words, it's all the time lost. Yes, in communication we go for saying, meaning is in the mind, but nothing like that here. What the person wants to convey, he never succeeds in conveying that. Something very, very weird and absurd that existed in absurd fiction. And as a genuine instrument for logic, language is a vehicle. We express our thoughts, our ideas by using the instrument of language. But that language was in a way used to confuse, to present something which is not meaningful at all by the writers of absurd fiction. While a great deal of absurdist fiction may be humorous or irrational in nature, the hallmark of this particular kind is neither comedy nor nonsense, but rather the study of human behavior under circumstances that appear to be purposeless and philosophically absurd. The moral of the story is generally not explicit, not clear, and the themes or characters' realizations are often ambiguous in nature. Additionally, unlike many other forms of fiction, absurdist works will not necessarily have a traditional plot structure, that is a kind of rising action, climax, falling action, etc. That means all the stages or pattern which is there in the regular plays does not exist in an absurd drama, absurd play. Let's have a look at the themes which were very commonly used in absurd works. The concept absurdism when it was in vogue. The first and foremost one is absurdity. The meaning of absurdity is something which is apparently insensible. Rather than using a word like nonsense, I would be preferring to use something which is insensible, not which appeals to our sense, in the sense our logic or our reasoning. Absurdity is the most obvious theme explored in absurdism. Absurdity characterizes a world that no longer makes sense to its inhabitants, in which rational decisions are impossible and all action is meaningless and futile. Cruelty and violence is another theme which is generally taken up in the absurd works. Here, beneath the slapstick humor, look, even the humor is slapstick in the absurd works. There lurks an element of cruelty, often revealed in dialogue. How is that revealed? Not physically, but by the means of dialogues that is revealed. To give an example, in the room, a blind man is brutally beaten. A man who is blind is brutally beaten. In the birthday party, the celebration becomes an interrogation and eventually abduction. The birthday party turns out to be a kind of abduction. Then in another play, The Lesson, a professor frustrated by his students' inability to understand, and look, even the professor's lesson was something meaningless. He goes for savagely killing one after other. That's the way how it is presented. A lecture which was meaningless rendered by a professor, and that when it was not followed by the students, he goes for savagely killing students one after other. Another theme which is very predominant in the works of absurdism are domination. Several well-known absurdist works feature pairs of characters in which one is dominant and the other is dominated. Dominant, dominated. A kind of master-slave relation is what depicted in the works of absurd writers. The next one is Futility and passivity, like the word itself connotes, absurd, something which is futile, something which is passive. It was also a very dominant theme in the works of absurd literature. The next one is the language. As previously told, the failure of language to convey meaning is an important theme in the literature of absurdism. Language is either detached from any interpretation that can be agreed to by all characters, or it is reduced to mere gibberish. That means something which you cannot understand, which you cannot make out, identify. The language of religious dedication is employed. To give an example to substantiate what I said, that means language never made any sense. It was used diverse way, distorted way. Like the language of religious dedication is employed by Adamov in his play Ping Pong. And here the object that is adored is a pinball machine. Look the absurd concept here. The object that he is adoring by using very pompous language, pompous expressions, is nothing but a pinball machine. But he is doing it with a kind of religious dedication, something as if you are rendering a sermon, some preaching session, something like as you get to listen in a church or something, a kind of religious thing. But the object which is venerated, which is praised here, adored here, is just a pinball machine. Next theme which is very predominant is loneliness and isolation. Many absurdist works illustrate the loneliness and isolation of human beings, individuals, resulting from the nature of modern life. And in some cases, it is further exaggerated, where couple like a husband and wife, when they happen to meet in a social setting, they vaguely remember to have met sometime before. They have distanced themselves from one another, where they are not able to identify, fine, he or she was his spouse. The theme of materialism is also very, very common in the works of absurdism. Here, let's have a look at the American dream, where even relationship between a family member is subjected to terms of profit and loss. Materialistic feeling, that means nothing where you have got real emotions or feelings. A woman marries a man she does not like, but because he is rich, she goes for marrying a man simply because he is wealthy. Then they as couple go for buying a baby to complete their family. And when the baby dies, they are mourning. They are not mourning the loss of the baby, but they are mourning their financial loss. So this kind of materialism is in a very sarcastic way presented in the works of absurd writers. Then thus, having a look at all the themes, we can say absurd fiction often explores disbeliever topics. We generally, in our true sense, when we want to think in a logical way, we never believe these kind of things happen. But yes, when you just try to reflect in your own way, yes, sometimes these are some certain things which may pinch us. So apart from the above, the common elements in absurdist fiction include satire, dark humor, strangeness, the abasement of reason, and controversy regarding the philosophical condition of being nothing. That means futility is something which is generally presented in the works of absurd writers, absurd authors. Then apart from this, to understand better what is an absurdism, let's have a look at the style, the presentation. Yes, previously we have discussed there is nothing like a style at all, but then there are a few components. How are they presented? Let's try to understand them from the concept absurd point of view. First and foremost is the character. Absurdism often abandons traditional characters development to offer figures that have no clear identity. That means, as we said, roles are interchangeable. The one who enters in the form of one person may just go for donning the role of somebody else. That means there is nothing like a character development in an absurd play. Denouement is another thing where we generally have a kind of beginning and end as such, but here nothing as such. It's only repetitious, and such repetitive actions reinforce the idea that human effort is futile. The style also again focuses or tilts the attention towards one thing, that is futility. Next is dialogue. Like we just now discussed, language is something which was exploited to convey the futility. The ability of language to convey meaning is called into question by absurdism. Dialogue is of special importance in absurdist works. Artificial language, empty of meaning, consisting of slogans and cliches, is the hallmark. Artificiality in the presentation, the way how the slogans are used, all these are very dominant traits. Look, there is no style, but the style itself is so peculiar. Something which is very bizarre is the style. Many of the texts contain dialogues that appear to be meaningless, but that mimic the style of educated or sophisticated speech. Often there is a marked contradiction between speech and action. Apart from this, when you look at the plot in the works of absurd authors, absurdism is a kind of extreme where all the conventions are abundant. That's the reason it's called absurd. Beckett's Waiting for Godot has been described as a play in which nothing happens. The opening line itself says nothing to be done, and the characters proceed to do just nothing. Apart from that, when we talk about setting is something again very unconventional. Typically, the absurd play, the stage is empty to convey the passivity. There is nothing like a kind of hope or something where there is life as such. So stage settings tend to be very sparse, very less, with lots of vacant space, conveying the sense of emptiness, which is in turn associated with the characters' lives. The most comprehensive essay on the absurd is written by Albert Camus, the French philosopher and Nobel Prize winner. According to him, the world is not essentially absurd, and neither is it definite to the individual. The absurd is itself the lack of communication between the two parties. The interaction between the individual and the world gives rise to the absurd because neither can be condensed to the other's reality. That means all the time the creator and the creation is in conflict with one another. That's what is presented by Albert Camus. And he tried to re-emphasize, to hyphenate the same, he goes for taking examples from real life. And the examples which are taken by him are 6 in number, and each one is just something which we encounter in our day-to-day life. He says the first instance is something, a feeling of void is very absurd, and the second one is mechanical living, monotony. That means there is nothing like something to look forward to, feel good factor, something very passive and monotonous is also speaking about absurdity of life. See, what I am trying to convey here is Albert Camus, who has done a very important work, whose work is very popular in the field of absurdism. He goes for bringing to light some instances from real life which will make us understand life is absurd. And the first one is feeling of void. When you are leading life all hail healthy, when you feel futility, when you feel there is nothing to look forward to, it's absurd, he says. We are alive, but still we feel there is a kind of void in our life. The second one is mechanical living. Like every day we get up with some sort of agenda or a kind of plan, may not be on paper, but then something is there for which we look out. Maybe we are on the lookout for the morning, but then at the end of the day a kind of mechanical feeling is there. So this also speaks about the absurdity in life, in day-to-day life. And the third situation is a person becomes aware of time passing and begins to make plans for a better future. But this is absurd and irrational because people are caught in time. That means you are leading life, you look forward to something, but again when the time elapses, when it's beyond you, you just go for making some plans. So that is something very absurd, he says, again from real life. The fourth example can be experienced when people perceive a familiar object differently because they have a different understanding of it. It is said in communication, meaning is in the mind. I go for saying the same thing, but the way how you perceive comes with a kind of filter that you hold in front of you, and that filter is because the kind of exposure that you have. Could be your education, your experience, maybe in life, the education, circumstances, society, whatever. But because of your situation, you are holding a filter in front of you, and anything that comes to you comes with the tinge that filter has. So he says even this is something very absurd. You are experiencing the same thing, but the feeling is diverse, the feeling is something different. The fifth occasion is when we have severe feeling of isolation from our fellow humans. We become confused when we perceive human beings as non-humans. That means you are living with your friends or say with your family in a society, but still a sense of isolation. Why is that? Here again he tries to hyphenate Albert Camus. See, this is absurdity of life. You are with your family, but still you feel you're all alone, you're isolated. Yes, we get to hear this many times, right? Like, I'm feeling low, I am down. Why? Why is it happening? Are you not with your people? Is the day something different? No, everything is same. So he's trying to tell from real life there is conflict between the creation and the creator. Every individual, everybody has a kind of positive feeling for himself, but still are we successful? No. The reason? Creation doesn't want you to be happy, but the creator has created you. So he's trying to bring in that kind of understanding, like there is absurdity in the life itself. Final example given by Albert Camus is death and the emotional response it evokes within us. We are all mortal, but the fact that we want to live forever is ultimately absurd. Yes. See, the concept absurdism is called a philosophical concept. Why? There are a few things which are beyond the purview of common mindset, common thinking, but they are dwelled, they are discussed here. Look, we human beings are ultimately quite ambitious. But he says, you are mortal, you are bound to die someday. But why are you so greedy? May not be greedy, but then you are sometimes trying to compromise on your values, on many things, only because you know ultimately you are going to die someday. But still, knowing fully well there is something which is predestined, there is something, a kind of end to you, still you are trying to forget everything and lead life as if you are immortal. You are going to be there forever. This is something very absurd. So with the 6 examples, Albert Camus says that there is absurdity in our life. Beginning with birth to death, everywhere you get to see absurdity, futility, void, isolation, feeling of uncertainty, being very greedy, trying to behave as if we are immortal. All these are very good examples of absurdity in real life. To conclude, looking at the meaning of the term absurdism, the theatre of the absurd, the trying to break off from the conventions and the themes which are there, the futility of the human effort to achieve what they desire. There is a kind of underlying philosophical element which is projected in the works of absurd writers, that is, human beings aspire for something which they may not be able to. It's neither lofty nor something very noble, but something which is very trivial, materialistic, very commonplace, ordinary, compromising on something which is ultimate. So it has got a very deep message, the concept of absurdism, and that you will understand fully when you get to read the works of absurd dramatists and fiction writers.